So step 2 is where we analyze the thoughts that we've captured in step 1. One can also think of this as the rationalization step. One of the founders of cognitive approaches, Albert Ellis, back in the 1960s, named his brand of CBT Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, or REBT. Now, his theory was that people suffered emotional issues like anxiety because their thinking had become irrational, and thus their beliefs or perspectives were also irrational. And I believe that Albert was dead on. So this step is really about analyzing our thinking and looking for the irrational components and then rationalizing them accordingly. But it isn't that simple. Now, the difference between analyzing and reconstructing, which is the next step, is the difference between analyzing our thinking and constructing the rational response that ultimately will be converted into a rational response tool that we can use every single day. So there really isn't a clear line of demarcation between the two, but I'm going to treat them as separate steps just for the purpose of explaining the process. In reality, they kind of happen at the same time. Now, there are multiple ways to analyze information, but in this case, I want to demonstrate what I call a statistical analysis. Now, I believe that this kind of analysis is the most potent one to use when we're dealing with anxiety and fear and panic, especially the pandemic we're in right now. So I'm going to focus on just this one for now, but keep in mind that there are multiple ways to analyze irrational thinking. So let's go back to my client who was afraid that the food supply might run out and that he would not be able to feed his kids. And by the way, I got permission from this client to air this in his irrational thinking, and his exact words were, "Dude, go for it." So after he told me this out loud, told me about his fears, I asked him what he thought the probability was that we would actually run out of food and have to resort to hunting animals for protein in some sort of a post-apocalyptic fashion. I asked him what he thought the probability was that this would actually happen. There was no hesitation. He said 3%. And as soon as he said it, I could see the look on his face, as in, I kind of think I know where you're going with this. So my next response, and this is a pretty big point here, was, then that should only be getting about 3% of your attention, shouldn't it? Yep. And he admitted it was getting a lot more than 3%. Now, if at that point I would have said, there you go, reduce that to 3%, that negative thinking to 3%, and we're good to go. If I'd have said that, I would have been doing him a huge disservice. He got the concept right away, but just how do we now go about reducing that attention that we give to our irrational thinking? Well, listen closely here. The only way to do that, and I really believe it is the only way, is to increase the rational thinking that represents a mutually exclusive rational counterthought. And you're thinking, what the heck is that? Well, allow me to explain. Mutually exclusive simply means that they cannot both occur at the same time. Like the flip of a coin, it's either heads or tails. It just can't be both. It is so important to understand this principle. And if you're wondering where it came from, the answer is from David Eagleman in his book, The Brain, The Story of You, which is a fantastic and engaging read, as is his other book, Incognito. I would recommend both of them. Great reads. Now, I don't believe David calls it a mutually exclusive principle, or at least I don't think he called it that. He explains it very well, and I just gave it that name because that's how it makes sense to me. So how does it fit in here? Well, there are literally an infinite number of scenarios that are mutually exclusive to the scenario of a post-apocalyptic world coming out of this pandemic, starting with the best case scenario. So if we designate the post-apocalyptic scenario as the worst case, then what would be the best? So my client and I went to work on that. What we came up with was, and there could be lots of different ways to do this, but the best case would be that the empty store shelves right now that are kind of creating a panic would be quickly filled back up, and that there would be absolutely no further interruption to our food supply. That this was just a knee-jerk hiccup, and that was it. What then is the probability of that happening? I asked. Well, we both agreed that it sounded like a much higher probability, probably 20 to 25%. But we're still not done here. So let's say we throw out the best and the worst and just look at the middle ground. All of the scenarios that fall somewhere between best and worst, and those that fall in the middle. Now here is where it gets really interesting for me, and I hope it gets interesting for you too when I explain this. I'm a science guy by heart, love science, and I really love statistics. And scenarios, like most things in life, follow a bell curve or a normal curve or what we call a standard distribution. What this simply means is that if you look at the entire population of something, most of that population falls around the middle or the average. Roughly 68% of anything, including scenarios, falls close to the average, or what statisticians call within one standard distribution of the norm, or the average. And then an additional 28% fall within two standard deviations for a total of 96%, leaving only 4% in the tails, 2% on either end. Now, I don't want to get too far out in the weeds here, but let me explain how this applies. So in most cases, the worst case scenario then has just a 2% chance of happening, as does the best case scenario. And everything else, 96%, falls somewhere in between, with the greatest concentration close to 70%, falling around the average. So, in the simplest of terms, I can statistically predict with a lot of accuracy that there is a 70% probability, roughly, that the scenario that's going to happen falls in the average category. Now, interestingly, when my client said 3%, he had no idea that he was only 1% away from true actual statistics. So what's the average scenario? Well, we went to work on that, and that can fall out an infinite number of ways. But the average scenario, so if you split the difference between the apocalypse and business as usual, is maybe this. Maybe there's a shortage on some things for a while. Maybe the freshest of foods might be gone. Maybe the most nutritious, or even what we might like to eat, but we are eons away from starvation. And we discussed all kinds of different food, like all the processed crap there is out there. I mean, how long before we run out of all that junk? There's plenty to go around, I think. The boxed stuff. You know, fresh food, yeah, that might be much better for us, but you know what? We can live a long time on junk food, right? I mean, Americans have been doing that for years, haven't they? So it's not best case to have to eat all that crap, but it'll keep us alive for a long, long time. So it's not the worst case either. Now, all the while, I could sense my client relaxing as we were completely deconstructing his worst case scenario with one that made sense and could be supported statistically, mathematically, and most of all, rationally. Now, I want to interject right here that there's no way I would expect any of my clients to be able to do this. This is where I come into the mix. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've rationalized just about every irrational thought you can think of. And I'm pretty confident I can rationalize any irrational thought. And by the way, I think I ought to mention here that rationalizing has really gotten a twisted bad rap in our society somehow. Rationalizing something often seems to get a negative connotation, as in, you're just rationaling. trying to make something that is irrational seem rational. It really should be the other way around. Maybe we should call it irrationalizing or something else altogether, because the true practice of rationalizing is a really, really good thing to know how to do. Now, I also want to point this out too. This new scenario that we were working on was custom built on the spot to exactly fit the apocalyptic scenario that I was presented with, right? Not just any old positive thoughts. These were built right around the fear. So trust me, I hadn't considered this scenario prior to meeting with this client. We built that right on the spot, and it has to fit in a specific way. So let me take just a moment here while I'm thinking about it to highlight the difference between a mutually exclusive thought, or inclusive, a mutually inclusive thought, like, for instance, I'm thankful for my beautiful family. You know, that's great. You can be thankful for your beautiful family, and you can be afraid of food running out at the same time or simultaneously. Those are mutually inclusive. But I cannot be both afraid of running out of food and not afraid, right? Or afraid of running out of food and convinced we won't run out of food. Those two things are mutually exclusive. Or more precisely, the probability of running out of food and the probability of having enough can't both be high, can they? Now, at this point, if it seems to you like we're going to a lot of trouble to rationalize an irrational thought, my answer is, you darn right we are. It's either go through a lot of trouble or, hey, keep your irrational thoughts and keep right on wondering why you can't stop worrying. The choice is completely yours. So yes, this is kind of an involved process, which is why you need some special training, some information that you didn't know before, and some good coaching. Trying to make this seem any easier would be just irresponsible on my part, and tantamount to saying, just keep your worry. And I can't do that. I've got to give it just like it should be given, the straight scoop. And right now, my friends, is the most critical time in our lives to get worry and stress under control, at least in my life. And this is getting worse by the hour. So it's getting increasingly harder to believe that everything is going to be okay. But at the end of the day, I can statistically predict with confidence that the highest probability by far is that we're all going to be okay in the end. And actually probably a lot wiser for it. Now, I can't prove that, of course. But guess what? You can't prove me wrong either, can you? So as for me and my brain, statistics rule. And in the 2 decades of doing this, that I've been doing this, statistics have never let me down. Ever. And I'm 98% convinced they won't this time either. Yep, if you've been following along, that's 100% minus the 2% worst case scenario. So I could go on for hours about this, but I'll wrap it up right here. I'll wrap up step 2 and move on to step 3. Are you with me?